Alright, so today I want to show you 18 recessive ball python morphs. As a matter of fact, someone asked me once, how do I know the difference between a recessive, a dominant, and a co-dominant morph in ball pythons? And pretty much the only way you can really do it is to study genetics and figure out which one is which. And when it comes to recessive, there's not a whole lot of recessive morphs when it comes to ball pythons. And these 18 will pretty much cover almost all of the recessive mutations. And it's kind of interesting if you're actually looking for a project that is kind of a long-term project. Recessives are the way to go. As a matter of fact, recessives are usually pretty expensive because essentially what you're going to have to do is you actually have to have 2 copies of the gene for a visual recessive. Versus if you had something like this around my neck, this is Bobby, my bamboo ball python, and bamboos are actually a co-dominant mutation. So if I took this and I bred it to something, 50% of the offspring would come out as bamboos or bamboo combos. So essentially what you could do is you could take something like this, breed it through your collection, and in the very first year produce a whole bunch of bamboos. Versus if you had a recessive mutation, you actually would have something like a visual recessive, which has 2 copies of the gene. You breed it through your collection and you would get all normal looking snakes. They would be het for that recessive mutation. They'd be heterozygous with just 1 copy of the gene. And then the problem is with recessive is you'd actually have to wait for the females to mature, which is usually 2 to 3 years before you could breed them back to a visual to get more genes back into your recessive project. And I'd say it's a lot longer of a game when you're dealing with recessives. Kind of keeps the prices a little bit higher too, which is pretty awesome. So today what I'm going to do is I want to jump over to the internet and I want to show you 18 recessive ball python morphs. Alright, so I'm going to jump over here on Morphmarket.com and I want to start with the rainbow ball python. The rainbow is pretty interesting. It's actually a version of albino and not a lot of people actually work with the rainbow. And as a matter of fact, there's so few rainbows over here that I actually couldn't find one without any other genes. I'm trying to just show you just the base morph without any other genes on top. And the closest I could come with the rainbow is the rainbow Enchi. This one's also het for ghost. And the interesting thing about this is if you look at the pattern, it's definitely reduced. And normally, you know, if you don't have any reduction in pattern, a lot of times you'll see like the Roswell gray alien head kind of a pattern on the side of this thing. You can definitely tell it kind of wiped out all that pattern. And the interesting thing about recessives that are not that popular is the prices are extremely high. So take a look at this. If you actually come over here and look at the price, this one's actually $5,000 for this rainbow. As a matter of fact, it is still for sale. It's not sold. So if you're looking for a really high-end recessive project, you may consider the rainbow. Here's one that I thought was pretty interesting. This is actually the Super Sentinel. And when I actually first started in ball pythons about 5 years ago, the Sentinel was actually considered a co-dominant mutation. And it's kind of interesting over here on Morphmarket, they've actually changed the kind of the label for this gene from co-dominant over to recessive. And usually when someone says Super Sentinel or Super anything, usually we're talking about 2 copies of a gene of a co-dominant morph. And in this case, they're saying Super Sentinel, but if you actually come over here on Morphmarket, it's actually in pink. It says Sentinel, which indicates that this is a recessive mutation. I think some people consider it recessive, some people consider it a co-dominant mutation. It's really kind of one of the anomalies. I just thought I'd throw it in there in case you kind of hear the kind of confusion between the Super Sentinel or the Sentinel visual, which normally we'd say, you know, 2 copies of the gene for a recessive. We usually just say it is a visual of the recessive mutation. So here's another one. This is actually a caramel albino, one of the versions of albino. It's not compatible with your regular albino. So if you actually took this and bred it to an albino, you get normal looking snakes that are het for albino and het for caramel albino. As a matter of fact, working with this gene, I had a couple of females that I bought early on, some really big monster female ball pythons that look completely normal, and they are 100% het for caramel albino. And this is the first year I'm actually breeding some scaleless head, 50% het caramel albinos back to those snakes, hoping for some visuals. Looks really awesome. And you definitely tell it's really different than your typical albino. Has a lot darker of a background, and on the caramel albino, it doesn't have really bright red eyes like you'd see in a typical albino. Here's another one. This is the Monarch. The Monarch is fairly, I'd say it's pretty rare. There's not a whole lot of people working with Monarch either, and the prices are really high. It's a really awesome morph. I really like this mutation. As a matter of fact, it kind of seems like it keeps the color and the contrast as it ages versus a lot of ball python morphs. They tend to kind of fade a little bit when they get older. If you actually take a look at the prices on some of this is actually $3,000, just sold in 2019. Really beautiful animal here, the Monarch ball python. So here is the Clown. The Clown I would consider, as far as recessive mutations, probably the king of combos when it comes to recessives. And it's kind of interesting, if you actually look at the Clown, I would say when I first started in ball pythons, I was looking at the Clown thinking, you know, that's not really that impressive. And people were buying them as fast as you could bring them to a reptile show. It was almost like people were fighting over clowns. They were so popular. And I couldn't really figure out why until you start seeing it mixed with other combos. And let me tell you, the Clown mixed with almost anything else makes a really fantastic combo. Really awesome recessive. I'd say probably the Clown and the Pieds are probably the top two recessive mutations as far as just sheer numbers and the popularity of the morphs. Here is a Lavender albino. The Lavender albino is pretty interesting because it looks almost exactly like a regular albino when it's younger, and as it grows and matures, it turns, you know, a lot of the bright white background kind of turns into this kind of a lavender color, thus the name Lavender. And it doesn't really have the bright red eyes that you'd see in like the regular albinos. I'd say probably the most popular lavender that I've seen is what they call the dreamsicle, which is a lavender albino and the pied, and they're really super like a bright orange kind of a pied looking, and it's really super popular. And the funny thing is about lavender albino pieds is they really keep their value. Over the last 5 years, it's been really holding strong. I'd say, I can't remember the prices, I think it was like over $2,000 for a dreamsicle, the lavender albino pied. And if you look at the kind of the price on this is kind of reasonable. This is $800. This happens to be a male, a fully mature male at 1,505 grams. Really awesome morph. Here is probably the most expensive recessive mutation that you can find. This is actually the Monsoon. This is pretty much brand new on the market. It hasn't been out for a long time. And I would say it's a really super visually dominant mutation. You mix anything with the Monsoon and it really just dominates it with this color and pattern. I'd say there's nothing really in ball pythons that has any kind of a pattern close to the Monsoon. Really awesome. And I'd like to get into this project at some time, but I'm kind of waiting for the price to come down. If you look at the price on this one, $15,000, and it actually sold just late last year. Pretty awesome. Probably one of the most impressive recessive mutations that has hit the market just recently. Here's another one. This is the Puzzle. The Puzzle's been out for quite a long time. I actually started in ball pythons about 5 years ago, and I had my eye on the Puzzle back then, and I still have my eye on it. As a matter of fact, it's really still really expensive. Makes some really awesome combos, and the Puzzle, essentially what it does is it kind of changes the pattern on the sides of the snake, and in combos, it really jumbles up the pattern. It almost makes like this streaking along the side. And if you actually look at the prices, this one actually sold, well, this was back in 2017, a couple of years ago, and it actually sold for $2,000. They're a little bit cheaper than that, but still a little bit out of my price range. Here is the Ultramel. The Ultramel is a pretty awesome morph. As a matter of fact, the Ultramel is probably the closest to the Monarch, and I would say the Ultramel is kind of like the poor man's Monarch when it comes to, you know, trying to get into some of these projects. And as a matter of fact, you can actually pick up an Ultramel for just a few $100s. Not as expensive as it was 5 years ago. It came down quite a bit. I think the Ultramel about 5 years ago was like between $600 and $800, and it's come down quite a bit since then. And this one, actually, if you look at the price on this one, $225 plus about 60 shipping. So you're looking at just a few $100s for an Ultramel. And I'd say probably my favorite Ultramel combo is the Ultramel Pied. The Ultra Pied is a really awesome combo. Here is the genetic stripe. As a matter of fact, when I first started about 5 years ago, genetic stripes were insanely expensive. And I think everyone was just kind of jumping on the genetic stripe bandwagon to produce more genetic stripes because it was like new on the market and there wasn't a whole lot actually produced. And people have produced quite a bit of stuff with the genetic stripe in the last few years. And I just love the clean, kind of the pattern on the genetic stripe. It has this really strong stripe right down the back of the snake and almost is kind of outlined in black and has another tone of a different color down the side. Makes for some really awesome combos. So here is another one that's fairly new on the market, the Sunset. As a matter of fact, 5 years ago, the only Sunset that I actually heard of, I'd actually come over to Morphmarket and people were selling het Sunsets. And it wasn't until a couple of years later that I actually saw a visual and they were super expensive. I didn't even know what they looked like. I was like, this is kind of interesting. What does the Sunset look like? And now there's quite a few Sunsets actually being produced and listed over here in Morphmarket. But if you look at the prices on the Sunset, this one's actually $4,000 still for sale for a hatchling Sunset. This is actually a female. And some of these morphs, you know, once they actually come down in price within my price range, and of course that price range is different for everybody. You know, some people can spend a few $100s, some people can spend maybe $1,000. I think right now probably about $1,500 is pretty much the maximum that I would spend investing in a project. And keep in mind, if you actually invest in something like this, you probably want to invest in a male and a female to get visuals right away to kind of get your return on investment. So you're thinking, you know, it's $4,000, but if you actually bought two of them, you're up to $8,000 for a pair of Sunsets. Still way out of my price range. Here's another one. This is the TriStripe. And then the TriStripe's pretty interesting because when I started 5 years ago, the TriStripe was fairly expensive and it's still pretty expensive. And there's not a lot of people actually working with the TriStripe. It's one of those that's kind of like a really small niche in the market. And sometimes you'll get, you know, sometimes like genetic anomalies or defects. And as far as I know, there's no genetic defects with the TriStripe. Like some are, you know, tend to have some kinking in the spine or some duck billing or maybe some, you know, like a head wobble or neurological issues. And there's nothing wrong as far as I know with the TriStripe. It's just kind of one of those that a lot of people aren't really investing in, and it's really kind of keeping the value over the long haul. This one's actually $1,750. Of course, this was back in 2016. They're a little bit cheaper, but the TriStripe is a really awesome combo. And essentially what it is you have multiple stripes right down the top of the snake. And sometimes you'll have a lot of striping and sometimes you won't. Sometimes you'll have this really obvious 3 stripes right down the top of the snake. Really awesome morph. All right, this is the candy. The candy's kind of interesting because it's also known as the toffee. The toffee and the candy, you know, some people consider them the same gene. Some people consider them different lines of the same gene, kind of like the butter and the lesser or the banana and the coral glow. A lot of people consider them either the same thing or 2 different lines. And the interesting thing about the candy slash toffee is that it's compatible with albino. So you actually take a candy, you breed it to albino, and you get candinos, which are kind of halfway between candies and albinos, which is a really awesome morph. I'd say there's not a lot of people working with candy. I kind of had my eye on this one at the beginning too, and they've come down significantly in price. Probably the biggest price drop that I've seen since I started in ball pythons. I think these were selling for like $1,000 when I started, and here is a male for just $325. Pretty amazing. So this is a desert ghost, and I think when it comes to morphs that are a little bit kind of like the hidden gem in ball pythons, I think the desert ghost is one of them. As a matter of fact, if you mix desert ghost with pastel, it makes one of the most impressive bright yellow snakes that I've ever seen. It really keeps a really high contrast and a bright yellow as it matures and grows older. Really awesome. I'm working quite a bit with desert ghost, and you have to really be careful because the desert ghost can also be confused with the desert, which is not very popular. The desert actually has some problems with the fertility of the females. And then we also have a gene known as ghost. So it's a little bit confusing because you can actually have a desert ghost that's composed of the problematic desert gene and the ghost gene, which is completely separate than the desert ghost. The desert ghost has no problems at all as far as genetics or deformities or anything like that. So speaking of ghosts, you know, this is actually, I'm kind of rolling this all in together as far as the ghost. This happens to be the orange ghost, and there's also several lines of just the regular ghost. And if you actually take a look at the snake, essentially what it is it fades out the snake a little bit, gives it kind of a creamy color, and a lot of times it actually reduces the overall contrast of the sharpness of the color between the lights and the darks. The ghost is pretty powerful, and it's very popular too. There's a lot of people into ghosts, and the orange ghost is a little bit different. As the snake matures, it gets kind of this orange color. So I'd say most ghosts, if you actually work with ghosts, working it into other genes, a lot of times you don't change the color of the final product by adding ghosts. You just kind of fade it out a little bit. And with the orange ghost, you actually add a little bit of orange to the color of the snake or the combination. Here is the piebald, and the pied is actually one of the first mutations on the scene in ball pythons. This is the one that really kick-started ball pythons, and when these first came out, these were selling for $25,000 for one snake. It was pretty incredible, and now you can pick them up just for a few $100. As a matter of fact, if we look at the price on this one, $225. It is pretty amazing. And 5 years ago, I think I was paying like $300 for a visual pied at the shows, and it's been holding pretty good over the last 5 years. Still almost the same price as they used to be back then. And the pied's really awesome. Essentially what it does is it brings in these splotches of white in the snake. And sometimes you get a high amount of white, and sometimes you get a low amount of white. And sometimes you can actually adjust the amount of white that's in the snake. As a matter of fact, if you want a really low white pied, you can actually mix in enchi. So an enchi pied is almost always a really low white pied. And I was actually just doing a morph review about the red axanthic. If you actually take red axanthic, mix it in with pied, you get a super high white pied with just a little bit of color right on the head. It's pretty awesome. So here is the albino. The albino was, believe it or not, the albino was the first ball python morph on the scene, even before the pied. I think the very first one was albino, and then the second one was the pied, which really kick-started everything. Starting out with two recessives, kind of both were long-term projects just coming out. And the albino, I'd say it's pretty much held its price ever since I started 5 years ago. Albinos are pretty much selling for almost exactly the same. If you actually take a look at this, $250. You know, actually back 5 years ago, albinos, hatchlings were selling for $250. Hasn't changed really much. And the cool thing about the albino is it really keeps the color and the contrast as the snake grows older. And all of them have really bright red eyes. And personally, I really like the bright red eyes. And I've actually seen quite a bit of people that walk up to my table at the reptile shows and they're like, I like all your snakes, but those red eyes, they just freak me out. I just cannot do an albino. I think it's kind of interesting that some people take offense at the red eyes. I thought that was kind of interesting. I think it's a really unique morph. There's not really any other ball python morph that has really bright red eyes. So here's the last one I wanted to show you. This is an axanthic ball python, and there's actually quite a few lines of axanthic. There's the VPI axanthic, the TSK axanthic, or the MJ axanthic, and pretty much all of them, what they do is they strip out all the colors, leaving like a black and a white and a gray and a silver kind of a color. And it's kind of interesting. Some axanthic lines actually kind of strip away more color than others do, and some of them actually start like a bright gray like this and kind of get grayed out or kind of browned out as they age and mature. But axanthics, there's actually some people that all they do in their whole breeding operation for ball pythons, all they work with is axanthics. It's a pretty powerful gene. Alright, so it is time for the question of the day. And Atrocious asks, what was your very first investment in ball pythons? And that is a very good question. As a matter of fact, my first investments were actually in snakes other than ball pythons. I actually got started into snakes by watching YouTube videos, how to breed snakes, and I was obsessed on breeding snakes. And it was kind of funny because I started with king snakes and Australian Woma pythons. I had all these different snakes, and it wasn't until I went to my very first reptile show, the NARBC in Tinley Park, which is pretty much considered like the Super Bowl of reptile shows. It was pretty incredible, and that is when I saw the people just going crazy over ball pythons. I was like, I have to have some ball pythons, and I actually bought 2 snakes at the first show that were ball pythons. It was actually a pair of pieds, visual pieds, a male and a female, and I think I paid about $300 a piece for my very first pieds. And it was shortly after that I actually kind of transitioned into investing in some of my racking systems. I actually started with wire racks and glass aquariums until I was up to about 20 snakes, and then I transitioned over to these ARS racks like the ones behind me. And the cool thing about the ARS racks is you can actually buy them one level at a time, and or as many levels as you want. My very first rack was just 3 levels of an ARS 7030, and I put them right over here on the floor and slowly added to them. I actually put some boa tubs under them and added some more different stuff. I put some ARS 18s underneath. I was actually thinking about breeding some Australian Woma pythons, and then I got to the point where I just realized the demand for ball pythons was so incredibly high that I decided to sell all my snakes except for my 2 reticulated pythons that just really focus on breeding ball pythons. So that is pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.